Okay, what I want to do is address two things about why we might be hesitant as advisors to talk to our clients about their buy-sell agreement. The first one is going to be maybe we think they're going to ask a question that we don't know. So we're going to talk a little bit about education on buy-sell agreements. And then secondly is our approach. And I want to give you what I think are some tips on how to address the business owners about it so they might be more positive in their response to you. So let's first start off with the different types of entities. This is basically Entity 101. I'm not going to get too deep into any of these, but a lot of businesses started off as a sole proprietorship. There's no incorporation. There's just one owner. They report all the income on their Schedule C on their 1040 return. So the next is the partnership. And sometimes there are multiple partners in an organization. There's no formal incorporation. It's just a general partnership. Don't see a lot of these anymore, but there are some out there. The limited liability company has come along and replaced a lot of that. Most startups now, it seems, they're going to be started as limited liability companies or LLCs, partly because that's just an easy way to avoid some personal liability in these companies. A limited liability partnership is the same as an LLC, but it's typically for attorneys, doctors, dentists, those in professional organizations. And then 5 and 6 are both corporations. It's just a difference in how they are taxed. The S corporation is what they call a pass-through entity, which means that the income on that is not paid by the corporation, but it's rather flows through to the individual owners on their K-1. You may have heard of that term. The C corporation is the corporation that's been around, 100 years for tax purposes, where the corporation does pay its own taxes, and that's a Form 1120. So anyway, I don't know, I might have gotten those forms backward. One's 1120, one's a 1065. So let's talk about a couple of buzzwords that you're going to hear throughout the conversation that might come into play so we kind of understand what we're talking about. The first we talked a little bit about already is a pass-through entity. Most LLCs are pass-through entities. S corporations or subchapter S, you may hear of them, are pass-through entities, whereas C corporations are not. All that means is who is actually paying the tax to Uncle Sam. Because unfortunately in this country, you can't make a profit in a business and avoid taxes. If you do, it's going to cost you about 20 years. So it just depends on who is going to be paying the tax. But that's really doesn't have a lot of effect on buy-sell agreements, but you need to know that and you ask if they're C, S, or LLC. The next thing we want to talk about is intestate. You may have heard of this term, but that's when someone dies without a will. And if someone dies without a will, each of the states have an order in which the estate will be distributed to the heirs of the decedent. I don't know all the intestate laws. We have an attorney on the line, Barry, who's you're going to have a chance to meet in a little bit. He might have more insight on that, but I just want to leave you with the feeling the intestate is a bad thing. You really want to have a will, and if your business owners have a will, it will make their beneficiaries' life a lot easier. The next thing is a triggering event, because all these buy-sell agreements have a triggering event. Typically, it's death and or disability. There may be a retirement trigger in there, but not likely. The death is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, there are no conditions or there are no degrees of death. It's either you're breathing or you're not. Whereas with disability, there are degrees of disability as far as Are you totally disabled? How long is it going to be? Permanent. So those triggering events will all be defined inside the document. And that is one of the big things that we'll be talking about, why these need to be reviewed periodically. Next is the strike price. That is the price that will be called for when business owner A buys out typically the decedent shares of stock. We'll talk, and Barry will talk more to that, I think, at the end about how that is. Some old agreements might have a fixed strike price in there, and years of inflation have eroded that. So it's another reason you need to review these contracts. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about shareholders versus stakeholders. The shareholders are actually the ones who own the company. It may be 50-50, 75-25, etc. But there are more people that have an interest in that business succeeding than just the shareholders. You've got employees, you might have bankers, bondholders, lenders, any number of people that might have an interest would be in the group called stakeholders. So when you talk about them, you might hear someone say stakeholders, they mean shareholders or vice versa. Just want to bring that to everybody's attention.
Another appointment review around 2:30.
So let's talk about the type of agreements. The first one, and most of these agreements are what they call binding agreements. So there is an agreement to, in the event of the triggering event, for the decedent's family, for example, to sell those shares to the surviving person. But there is a wait and see agreement that says when that time comes, I'm going to have the first right of refusal. Now, I'm going to start calling people Bob and Tom. I hope we don't have any Bobs or Toms on the phone because Bob, unfortunately, you're not going to make it to the end of the call. But so I'm going to make that easy just for us to talk about it. So if Bob dies, Tom would have the right to buy the shares of stock that Bob owned. If the value is greater than the strike price, he'd probably buy them. If not, he's probably going to pass on it. That's the first right of refusal. Then you've got entity purchase, cross endorsement, and trustee cross purchase. And I think it's going to be easier to go through these with a kind of a grid. So if you look at this as the entity purchase, in my opinion, is probably one of probably the simplest of all of them. And in this situation, the business, XYZ business, is going to buy a policy on Bob and Tom. They're going to pay the premiums. They're going to be the beneficiaries. When Bob passes away, the proceeds come into the business, not to Tom, but to the business. The business then redeems those shares from Bob's estate. And that's where the intestate comes in. If Bob has a will, that they're going to name an executor, and Tom's going to have an easier time of purchasing those shares. If it goes intestate, it's going to be a slow process until someone is named to be I believe they call that the administrator of the estate rather than the executor. But it's just going to slow the process down if Bob did not have a will. So your business owner, it's going to be uncomfortable for Tom to ask Bob if he has a will or vice versa, but it is an important thing and a consideration for that. Now, so that's the entity purchase. The next is the cross purchase. In this situation, the entity is not paying premiums to the beneficiary. It's that Bob buys a policy on Tom and Tom buys a policy on Bob. When Bob passes away, Tom receives the death benefit from the insurance company. So he has the $1 million. He is now going to buy that from Bob's estate. And Bob, by the agreement, Bob's estate is bound by the agreement to sell that to Tom. Okay, so those are the real two main ones: are cross purchase and entity purchase. We could go on the next one. Sometimes Bob might not want Tom to own a policy on his life or vice versa. There's something out there called a cross endorsement. I've never seen one in place. But what that means is that Bob owns his own policy and Tom owns his own policy. However, Tom rents the death benefit through a collateral assignment from Tom and vice versa. So now when the death occurs, Bob's death occurs, Tom gets that money through the assignment to pay for the shares of stock. It's very similar to the straight cross purchase. It's just a difference in the ownership and ownership designation of the policy. Okay, it's going to be complicated. And my theory is if you ever get the clients confused, you might as well pack up your bags and go home because the client's not going to do anything. This just leads to confusion. Okay, it's just my opinion. The next thing is a trustee cross purchase, because it's very easy when you only have two business owners to do a cross purchase. One buys a policy on Bob and Bob buys a policy on Tom. Two policies involved. But now if we introduce Mary into the equation, Mary has to buy a policy on Tom and Bob. Bob has to buy a policy on Tom and Mary, and Bob has to buy a policy on Tom and Mary. So now you got 6 policies instead of 2. If you get 4 partners, the numbers just grow exponentially. So instead of doing that, the name trustee cross purchases comes in from naming a trust. A lot of times now you see an LLC in lieu of a trust, but that tells you how long the trustee cross purchase has been around, is that this was prior to the LLCs. So the trust or LLC is the one that buys the policies. So now with 4 owners, they only have to buy 4 policies. The trust is owner and beneficiary of policies on all of the owners. It's kind of a little bit of a cross between the entity and the cross purchase, but the proceeds then come into the trust. The trust then redeems the shares of stock from the decedent's estate and then distributes those out to the remaining or surviving shareholders. Okay. Now, so let's go back to the one thing I didn't mention on the entity purchase. I'm going to go, if you had 3 business owners and one of them passes away, the remaining business owners now own 50% share in a $3 million company, and they are now underinsured if they're only insured for $1 million. That's one of the drawbacks on the entity purchase. Some of the other things that we see as pitfalls or come across in buy-sell agreements are the wrong beneficiary designation. I have seen where Bob buys the policy on Tom and wants to name Tom's beneficiary or spouse as the beneficiary of the policy. Okay, now what happens there? When Bob passes away, Bob's beneficiary receives the money, but not only do they have this money, they still got the shares of stock. So you don't ever want to name the same side of the ownership as beneficiary of a cross-sell policy. Name the other owner as the beneficiary. So now Tom receives those benefits, he buys the shares, rather than naming Bob's wife, because if Bob's wife is the beneficiary of a policy, she's got the proceeds and still owns the shares of stock and is under no obligation to share those life insurance proceeds back with Tom. Another thing we see is outdated beneficiary information. What that means is we recently had a case about 18 months ago, and there was an insurance agent, passed away. The beneficiary of his policy was his previous partner from 20 years ago. Guess who got the proceeds? The old business partner. So that's one of another reason, a big reason to review these buy-sell agreements. Do they have outdated information, old partners? And this is not just only the agreement, but also the insurance policy. Now, also sometimes you get an issue with two business owners. If Bob was 60 and Tom was 40, Tom's going to pay a higher premium for his policy on Bob than what Bob is going to pay on Tom. The younger owner is not going to like that because he's paying more for his purchase of insurance on the older partner. But here's how I explain that. You can do it with the cross endorsement. That will help a little bit. But how I explain it is, Tom, the life insurance premiums are based on life expectancy. Since Bob is paying twice for his premium, the premium of Bob is twice, that means his life expectancy is much shorter than yours. It also means then that Bob is probably more likely to pass away during this agreement. And who's going to benefit the most when Bob passes away? You are, because you're now going to own the business 100% and not deal with Bob's family. That's why you're paying a higher premium. So it's explainable if you stop and talk about it. The next thing I want to talk about, and I've never heard this talked about really in any discussions about buy-sell agreements, but when you do an entity purchase, the surviving shareholders still have that $1 million basis in the company, but they own half of a $3 million company. So when they sell it in the future, they're going to have a larger taxable gain in that situation. Whereas if they are under a cross purchase, that $1 million comes to them and then they buy out the surviving or the decedent's estate, their basis gets stepped up now to a larger amount. So when they sell it at retirement in the future, they will pay less capital gains. Now, that's what I've got on the education side. So I hope it's giving you enough information to feel comfortable to at least to start discussing buy-sells with your client. Now, one of the things that really always I see these things about approaching the client, because many times we just say, hey, Bob, do you have a buy-sell agreement? And what Bob is thinking in his mind, if he says yes, that means he's got to do some work because he's got to go find that buy-sell agreement. Bob doesn't have time to do that. So what's the quick answer? Quick answer is no. Or no, it's already been reviewed. We're good on the buy-sell agreement. So you're not going to get past that first question. So I've got two different scenarios to kind of help you on the approach so that you can build a reason for it and create some urgency with the client. Now, what I have done here is I've actually gone through the whole scenario. I did this so it would be actually in the PowerPoint presentation. So, for example, you go up and you say, Tom, how long have you and Bob been in business? He says 20 years. Oh, that's a long time. I'm sure your business has gone through a lot of change over that time. Yeah, we've really been fortunate over the years. Now, that's kind of a key word. I put fortunate in there because you've got to be listening. When somebody says fortunate, that means they've done pretty doggone well over the last 20 years. That's a business owner term. And I'm going to say, yeah, I've done great. Say I've been fortunate or I've been lucky. Those are two terms they might use. So you say, Tom, if your Bob got disabled or passed away, what would happen to the business? Oh, we've got an agreement for that. Well, is it written? That's the first question. Oh, it is written. That's good, Tom. It's good it's in writing, but how is the purchase price calculated? That's always a good question to start thinking. If the agreement was written when you started 20 years ago, the value in there might be out of date. Because what was $500,000 20 years ago, just due to inflation, is not the same. Your business may be worth $1 million, $2 million. I don't know. But also that insurance policy, if it's only $500,000, it might be underfunded. So I think it's time to review that. So we added some, and here's where you you make it a little easier for them to say yes. So we've added someone to our staff, that's us, that regularly reviews those types of documents and provides recommendations for any changes or modifications. Tom, you've been a great customer over the years. I can do this review complimentary for you if you'd like to proceed. Now, do you think your ratio of getting response, a positive response, is going to be greater than saying, do you have a buy-sell agreement? When was the last time you reviewed it? I think that you will get a lot better response out of this. And looking that you do this regularly drives that home. So that's scenario one. I've got a second one I like a little bit better. It says, Tom, do you have any idea what the value of your business is? Oh, I'm sorry. This one's Mary. I changed my time. Mary says $3 million. It's okay, Mary. How'd you come up with that number? And I ask, and you can use this as a true story, just happened about 18 months ago. No, 6 months ago. I asked because we recently talked to one of our clients and they estimated their business to be $5 million. We provided him an informal valuation that came out at $22 million. That was quite a surprise. He was thinking he was going to have to work 3 more years. So instead of waiting 3 years, he sold and just closed last week on a portion of the business for $16 million. He's still retaining another portion of the business and is going to continue working. So, Mary, we have this service that we offer our clients. It's a complimentary business valuation. It's not a formal appraisal, but it assesses the value of business compared to others in your field. Along with that, we'll review your partnership agreements and be sure you and your family are protected in the event of death or disability of one of your partners. Would you like to proceed? 2 different approaches to that. Now, so I hope that we've got 2 takeaways here, that we've given you some education on buy-sell that you feel more comfortable, because just remember, no matter who the client is, you're probably going to know more than 95% of them. Okay, so don't be intimidated that you think you don't know enough. The second thing, because you can always refer back to, you got an expert in the office who does these valuations and reviews. It's not you, it's somebody in your office. And then the second one is to help you with that approach, because if sometimes we're too direct in our business, and it's easier for the business owner to say no than it is to say yes. Now, that really concludes my remarks on this, but we've got Barry Leach with us, who's an attorney. I want to introduce you to him so that if you've got questions, I might handle the sales questions. Barry's going to handle the legal questions because I am not an attorney. I know enough to be dangerous. I did stay at a Holiday Inn last week. But here's Barry. So Barry, go ahead, take a minute to introduce yourself.
Well, let me, Ralph, I'll go ahead and introduce Barry. Just
okay.
So you don't have to. So Barry is a very good friend of mine. Barry is a partner in a firm named Ellis Funk in Atlanta. He has over 40 years of legal experience, specializing in expertise in business and corporate law, as well as estate planning law. So Barry, welcome, and please, tell us a little bit more about you, and then we can open up for some questions here.
All right. Well, thank you, Todd. As Todd mentioned, I represent a lot of closely held businesses, and I do a lot of work with their legal documents as far as trying to document these buy-sell arrangements. So if it's a limited liability company, it's normally built into a document called an operating agreement. And if it's a corporation, there's typically what we call a shareholders agreement. And everyone is different. It depends a lot on a lot of different factors. But one of the things that typically slow people down, as Ralph mentioned, is how do we go about valuing this business? If one of us should die or become disabled, how do we know what's a fair price? And I explain to people there's typically 3 different ways that you can approach that. One way is that the owners can get together once a year and sit down, and the 2 of them can mutually agree, this is what we think the business is worth, and if something happens to one of us, that's going to be the purchase price. Typically not the most accurate way to come up with a number, but some people like that approach. What I see as a practical matter is, leaving aside how accurate or inaccurate the number is typically after the first year, they forget to do it again in subsequent years. And so they end up with an agreement with a number that they came up with 8 or 10 years ago. Another method is they sometimes work with their CPAs to come up with a formula, and says, we believe that this formula will come up with a fair purchase price for the company. And so a lot of times it may involve multiples of EBITDA, or things along those lines, with some adjustments or some weighted averages. I've done a lot of different formulas. Again, formulas may or may not be indicative of the true value of the company. Plus, depending on market conditions, in some years, companies are selling for multiples of 8 or 10 times EBITDA. In other years, it might be 4. And so what may be an accurate formula in one year may not carry over to a subsequent year. Probably the best methodology would be to hire an outside company that values closely held businesses for a living. That's what they do. And they are very sophisticated, and they probably will come up with at least the closest number to what the business is truly worth. You never really know until you try to sell the business what it's truly worth, but they'll probably come up with a number that is closer to the actual value than any of the other methods. The reason why clients sometimes resist going that route is because they have to pay these valuation experts anywhere from $3,500 to $35,000 to come up with a valuation. And so sometimes they bristle when they think they may have to come out of pocket to come up with a number. But if you have a business that's worth multiple millions of dollars, I personally think it's money well spent. And that does work well in the context of death. If you have owners that are insurable, as far as, once you come up with a strike price, how you're going to actually pay for it. Life insurance can either fully fund it or partially fund it, depending on how expensive the insurance is and whether the owners are insurable at all. A disability can be a little trickier, because if you want to fund it with disability insurance, sometimes that can get expensive. So we always suggest to the owners that they go and price out these different insurance products to figure out whether they're affordable. And then as Ralph mentioned, you've got to come up with a definition of, how do you determine if someone is actually disabled? And the way I like it is, if they have a disability insurance policy and the insurance company starts paying you disability benefits, you're disabled. If there is no policy, then you could theoretically say, well, if Social Security pays you disability benefits, you're disabled. But if any of you have ever dealt with Social Security disability, it's almost impossible to collect those benefits. I'm personally not a fan of that methodology. Or the other is you get a physician to certify that, in his professional opinion, you're incapable of performing, substantially all of your duties as an employee of the company, and he anticipates that disability will last for an extended period of time, whether it's 6 months or 12 months or 18 months.
Yeah, Barry, let me interrupt you here just a second. On the disability side, we didn't cover that much, because we don't see a lot of disability in the buy-sell arena, and mainly because the life insurance is so cheap, because we're selling term for the most part.
Yeah.
Disability coverage is much more expensive. So most business owners may be presented with it, but they don't pull the trigger on it due to the premiums.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well, Ralph, is they'll price it out and then they'll decide against it for that reason. And so we use these other methodologies, but typically most of the businesses I'm working with, the owners are actively involved in the business. And so most times these triggering events would include, something like one of them becoming disabled and possibly just, retiring or quitting, or just no longer actively involved in the business. And so sometimes we have a mandatory repurchase. Sometimes it's discretionary by the shareholder that's staying behind. Sometimes we have exceptions where they can pass on the ownership to family members. Sometimes we condition that on the family member being actively employed by the company. So these agreements are all customized depending on the factual situation of the ownership of the company. It's not uncommon to have, children actively involved in the business. So sometimes the owners want to be able to pass on their ownership to their children. And we also deal with that in a death scenario. And sometimes you have a business that's only owned by one person, and he wants all of his children to inherit the business, but only some of them are actively involved in the business. And that creates all sorts of family discord when you have some people working for the company and some people not. So we face a lot of different fact patterns and try to work our way through them.
Yeah. All right. Let's open it up for questions. So you can either put them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself or raise your hand and we'll call on you. Christy, if you'll figure out, Christy's the expert on the Zoom. So if you raise your hand and want to ask a question, Christy, call on them, or like I said, put it in the chat box.
Okay, right now, since you're the host, you might have to unmute them for me,
Oh.
Ralph, unless you want me to.
How
Unless
do
you
I,
wanna do it either way.
you take back the host?
Let's see, hang on. Let me see.
Do I need to?
Yeah, I might have to, you might have to, I'm seeing if I can prompt you. 1 second. There. Let's see. And reclaim host, there we go. Okay,
All right. Does anybody have any questions? Right. Did anybody feel that 30 or 45 minutes was beneficial in talking about buy-sell agreements?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Barry, I've got a question, which is at what stage does the attorney get involved in terms of the documentation, the actual agreement? Is that the last thing done, or is that done prior to setting up a policy?
Typically, you're working on it simultaneously. So while you're trying to get the agreement in final form, they're at the same time making sure they're insurable and they can obtain a policy at a price that they can live with.
Right.
And so normally we're doing it in coordination with the insurance people. So as we're trying to fine tune the agreement and work through the different fact patterns and how they want to address each one, they're also making sure that they can get the insurance that's going to fund the buy sell, and that they can live with the premium structure.
So first things first, the valuation becomes really imperative for all of those discussions. We have to have what's considered a realistic valuation of the business.
Yeah, because otherwise you have no idea how much insurance you need.
Right.
And then you're anticipating that the company is going to grow and appreciate in value over time. So do you buy more insurance than you need currently? Or do you hope that when the time comes and you decide to increase the insurance that you're still insurable? So those are all issues that you've got to work through.
Right.
And this valuation that I was talking about too, it is complementary. We've got a couple of insurance companies that will do it. We also have some software that we have access to that will do it. It's not the formal valuation that Barry was mentioning. That's $3,500 to $30,000. But it is something that gets fairly close to what the value was. I think on that one we were talking about that just closed recently, our first estimate was on ours was 22 million, I think, and the formal valuation came back at 24, but that was a far cry from $5 million, which they were almost willing to take when we first started talking to them. So they're fairly happy with us. think he has a smile on his face when he signed the paperwork last week.
I bet, and he still retained some ownership, you said too. So.
Well, he broke it up into two groups. So he sold off one portion of the business and retained another portion. He's going to remain active in the second portion. But those are the stories that you get from asking people. I'll tell you, if any of you involved in the PNC business, if you're writing bonds, I would almost make this a part of say, hey, the bond company wants a copy of your buy-sell agreement. That they're going to be so excited they want to get the bond. They're going to hand over that agreement without even batting an eye. Okay. And then you've got that, and you have the opportunity to review it and make recommendations. But if the client wants something from you, they're much happier to bend over backwards to find it for you than if you just straight up ask them and say, I'm trying to sell you something, I need a copy of your buy-sell. But like if you're doing bonds, bond companies do ask for a lot of financial information, and asking for the buy-sell agreement would not be out of the ordinary. I see Judd and Clint on there. Y'all might agree or disagree with me, but I know y'all are in the PNC business. I don't know if you're writing bonds, but the PNC companies ask a lot of information.
Hey, Ralph, this is Stevie Hill from Northwestern Mutual. You gave an
Yes, sir.
example about a 60-year-old and 40-year-old partner in a buy-sell.
Mhm.
So I have something close to like a 42-year-old, 65-year-old that I'm working with on a buy-sell possibility. That difference in price is something I've thought about. And is there any reason why wouldn't the best course of action just to have the company pay for both premiums rather than a cross purchase in that situation?
If the hurdle is the difference in premium, yeah, the entity purchase does take that away. In their mind, I mean, it's still the difference in premium is still going to be there.
Right.
It's just whether it's paid by them personally or paid by the company. But
Mhm.
again, I go back to it. The 42-year-old is really getting a bigger benefit than the 65-year-old is.
Mhm.
But they can't. It's very difficult for them to comprehend that because the 42-year-old said, "I'm paying a 65-year-old premium."
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you are, because you benefit when he passes away.
Yeah.
Barry, what you probably see that too. How do you react to that?
Well, I still like the cross purchase for the step up in basis. So if I only have two people, so sometimes what they'll do is they'll say, look, we'll have the company just bonus out the money to the two shareholders in disproportionate amounts to enable them to pay the premiums. And that's both parties seem to be okay with that. So I've seen that happen a lot where they just bonus them out when it's time to pay the premium.
And Barry, could you speak again to the step up? Does the cross entity or the cross purchase enable the step up where the entity does not enable that?
Correct. That's correct.
Can you explain
So-
that again, please?
Yeah, so if Tom receives $1 million of life insurance proceeds and purchases 50% of the company from Bob, then if he subsequently sells that stock, he's got a new $1 million income tax basis in the stock he bought from Bob. If the entity purchased it, then he still ends up owning 100% of the company, but his basis is what he originally invested in his shares. He didn't get any bump up from those insurance proceeds.
Yeah, that's not really. I don't ever see agents talking about that or hear that as a conversation piece. As they're trying to talk about this with buy-sell prospects.
Yep. Barry, do you have any advice on any planning if people have real estate tax issues and they're trying to do buy-sell planning? Is there any way to be very estate tax conscious in the buy-sell agreements or the planning?
Well, yes, but it kind of depends. So there's conflicting interest there. If you're in a taxable situation, but you also own a portion of a very large business, you don't want to sell it at a deflated value just because you're going to have to pay estate taxes on it. So it's different if you owned 100% of the company. that potentially opens up some different avenues for you. But if you're going to sell, let's say 50% of it when you die, you're going to want to receive, actual value for that 50%. But there are other things that you could do from a planning standpoint before you die with those shares, assuming your partner is okay with, for instance, having other shareholders besides yourself. Sometimes what we'll do is we'll do what's called the recapitalization of the business, where we'll have both voting shares and non-voting shares. And if they're identical except for voting rights, it won't impact your S election if you're an S corp. But you can start gifting the non-voting shares, and it doesn't impact the active management of the business in any way. But you can take those non-voting shares and not only gift them and take a discount on it because they're non-voting, but also any future appreciation on those shares are going to escape estate taxation. So there's different planning opportunities you can avail yourself of.
Yeah, Steve, we had a case one time. We had a gardener that had a huge nursery, and he wanted to give it to his son. So what we did is we started buying all the new inventory of the new corporation owned by the son and directing all the customers over to the new nursery. So it became ABC Nursery to ABC One Nursery, and over time got all the business out of ABC Nursery to ABC One Nursery.
That's good.
All right, anybody else got any questions? I want to thank Barry for joining us. I want to thank everybody for being on the call. If you need us, the last slide, I don't know if we put it up there, Christy, but the last slide shows the phone number for Barry. His email is BLEITZ@ellisfunk.com. That's BLEITZ@ellisfunk.com. And with us, you know how to get with us. It's our first initial and first name, last name @brokerhouseins.com. Or the phone number's up on the screen now, I believe. So if you need us or want to ask any more questions, feel free to. And again, thank you for joining us. And I don't know if we'll have another one of these lunch and learns in December. We may, but I don't know. Everybody's going to be thinking holidays by then. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.